how's that for raising the
Stopwatch. It
stakes,
turned
huh?
right over at 15 minutes.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. I haven't been on this stage before. It's a beautiful opportunity, and thanks really to Suzanne for inviting me to participate in the book. And I don't really know what I'm doing here. I didn't litigate treaty rights cases, and I certainly didn't negotiate any treaties. So, unless you call that one time we were on the phone with the Indian Health Service area superintendent person who was complaining about how much money we spent on photocopies the year before. But so yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about Michigan Indians. And I was walking down the street yesterday, and the National Sculpture Museum is down the road, and it was dark and I could only see the outline, but I tell you what, I saw something that scared the hell out of me, and it looked a lot like the back of a man with giant bunny ears. And so I thought this is a good day to bring out some of the old stories, of which I really know nothing about, but the trickster for many Anishinaabe communities is a guy named Nanabuju. And so I'm going to draw from some of the things that I've learned over the years from smart people like Heidi Stark, who have used these trickster stories in some of her work to talk about Anishinaabe treaties. And so there's a lot of good stuff that has happened in terms of learning about the negotiation of these treaties, and especially in Michigan, I think, which is where I'm from. I'm a member of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. It's in the bio. And so I'm going to talk about some of the treaties that the Michigan Indians negotiated. I should also add that I'm a descendant of a Pokagon band of Potawatomi Indians, which is also in Michigan. I'm going to talk about the negotiation of some of the treaty negotiators from those old days. And hopefully I'll use that same trick that Brian just used to remember Kalkalchuk. Kalkalchuk. So I'm going to say Eshkwaganabe's name a lot today. I hope you remember it. All right, so let me start with, in light of really what I know most about Indian treaty negotiations in the 19th century can best be characterized as historical gossip, so here goes. 1821, this gives you a sense of how Michigan Indians treated their leaders, people they sent out to negotiate Indian treaties. Grand River, Ottawa. The Grand River is where Grand Rapids, Michigan is. It's a river that goes most of the way across the state. And it's also incredibly fertile farmland. So they had the benefit, unfortunately for them, being the first tribe to really have to deal with demands for their land because they were in such fertile farmland. They showed up at an Indian treaty negotiation that really didn't involve them. In Chicago in 1821, they sent a guy. They said, look, just go and find out what's going on. Tell us what the Chumukman are really doing. Chumukman are the white guys. And he came back and said, I had a great time, and I sold all the land south of the Grand River, and yeah. And so it becomes cloudy about what happens to him after that, but either he's banished or killed or banished and killed. He was not authorized to go there and sign a treaty with anybody. About a decade later, 10, 12 years later, the Potawatomis were negotiating a treaty. This is 1833, a few years after the Indian Removal Act. And they're even further south of the Grand River. And so they had the same problem in many ways that the Grand River Ottawas had, in that their land was had a long growing season and capable of generating a lot of revenue and money for American farmers. And most of the Potawatomi communities, Ogamuk, signed a treaty in 1833 that was a removal treaty. Many Potawatomis left before the removal started. Some did remove, mostly to Kansas and Iowa, and then some later on moved on to Oklahoma. Some came back to the northern peninsula of Michigan. There are about 11 Potawatomi nations now. The only one that stayed, at least in the context of these treaty negotiations, was the family under the name of a guy named Leopold Pokagon. Pokagon wasn't his nickname. He's kind of, if you imagine those Brazilian soccer players, all their cool nicknames like Hulk, and that's kind of how Pokagon got his name, because during the War of 1812 or something thereafter, he was seen using a human rib to beat somebody to death or something like that. And so they called him the Rib, which is Pokagon. And and you may know that's the name of the tribe now. So this is where we get this story. And Leopold was negotiating for his family. And he wasn't the head Potawatomi Ogumuk by any stretch of the imagination, but he did say to all of his people, his family members, and people that lived in his lodge, any of you touches a drop of alcohol, I'll kill you. And if you see anybody else around here touching drops of alcohol, kill them too. They all touched the alcohol, but he didn't kill them. But he did go into a tent with an American treaty negotiator who was a military man with a knife hidden underneath his belt and said, only one of us is coming out of here if you make me sign that treaty. And so he came out and he promised a few things to the American treaty negotiator, kind of like giving away ice in the wind. Sure, we'll become Catholics and all that good stuff, but we're not leaving. And so his community was able to stay in southwestern Michigan. The first thing they did with the treaty annuities was move to Grand Traverse Band community and Lake Leelanau, but they moved right back down there where they are now in the St. Joseph River Valley. There's a long history that goes to how they became federally recognized by an act of Congress in 1994 that I'm not going to get to, but it gives you a sense of what kind of acts and men of will that you have to be, people of will that you have to be to maintain a community overrun really by the Indian Removal Act. So that cuts me to, we're going to head a little bit north to the Grand Traverse Band Reservation, and a guy who lived on the eastern shore of the Grand Traverse Band in the 1830s named Ashwaubenon. Ashwaubenon, don't forget his name. It means little feather. And Ashwaubenon was, I liken him to the Boba Fett of Michigan Indian tribes, because if you know anything about Boba Fett, and you look carefully at the movies, there's a really creepy thing that he carries around his shoulder, and they're scalps. And Ashwaubenon carried scalps that he had earned in the War of 1812, American scalps. And so you can only imagine a guy who travels from what is now basically Traverse City, Michigan, all the way down to Washington, D.C., actually meets the president, Andrew Jackson, in 1836 in D.C. That must have been a surreal experience. The Indian fighter against the Indian fighter, so to speak. And Ashwaubenon was the lead speaker for the Michigan, Ottawa, and Chippewa tribes who traveled all the way down to D.C. to negotiate with Lewis Cass and Henry Schoolcraft. And compare this to, this was a really bad idea for the Michigan Ottawas to go to D.C. Many of the treaty negotiations that you saw later on in Minnesota and Wisconsin involved tribes negotiating on their home turf, where the military or the American negotiators would come and to visit the Indians in their lodge. And next to a hill with, say, 6,000 or 8,000 Indians overseeing the operation. Ashwaubenon was only one of 32 or 36 people from Michigan Indian Territory to go down and negotiate this treaty, but he was still pretty tough. And he said, there's no way we're going to sign a treaty giving away what ended up being about 1/3 of the entire landmass of the state of Michigan. And for a couple of days, he was winning. But Henry Schoolcraft was the Michigan treaty negotiator. He was the Michigan Indian agent. He married a Michigan Indian, a woman that went by the American name Jane Schoolcraft. He plagiarized a lot of her poetry, too. But he knew a lot about Michigan Indian leadership. He knew about the Ogumuk, and he knew about how villages were governed and how how their relationships together worked. And the 1836 treaty negotiations were supposed to be a treaty with the Michigan Ottawa communities and the lower peninsula of Michigan. And if you know the geography of Michigan, it looks a little bit like this, right? So here is the Ottawas, and here are the Chips, the Ojibs. So unfortunately for the Michigan Ottawas, Schoolcraft brought a couple guys down that he knew that were old friends, maybe relatives from the Upper Peninsula. They weren't real, they may have been Ogumuk at one time, but they weren't really in charge up there. And after a couple of days of listening to Ashwaubenon say, we're not going to sign your treaty the way you think we're going to sign it, He said, that doesn't matter because I got these friends of mine from the Upper Peninsula and they're going to sign the treaty. And when I take it to the Senate, they're not going to care who signed it. And it's going to look good to them and they're going to ratify it and you're going to be completely SOL. And Ashwaubenon and the rest of the Michigan Ottawas had no choice but to capitulate at that point. Luckily, the 1836 treaty contained Article 13, which said that that hunting and fishing and gathering rights and other usufructuary rights will exist on the ceded territory, the land they gave up, until the land is required for settlement. And if you've ever flown over the state of Michigan, you'll see about halfway through the Upper Peninsula, a little bit north of the Grand River, is all trees. Now, yeah, we thanks to, in 1900s, we deforested all of Michigan, but a lot of the trees are back. There really isn't a big growing season north of say Clare, Michigan, which is about midway through Michigan. And most of that land up there is either state or federal land. Not most of it, a good large chunk of it. And that land has never been required for settlement. And to this day, thanks to United States versus Michigan and multiple treaty negotiations with the feds and with the state of Michigan, Indian people in Michigan continue to hunt, fish, and gather and farm on those federal public lands, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres. And this is all because of Ashwaubenon and the people who went to Washington, D.C. And despite the fact that they didn't get entirely what they wanted, treaty rights are very, very meaningful to Indian people in Michigan to this day. I'm going to jump ahead quite considerably to the future in a moment, but I wanted to mention one incident in the 1870s in a small township in Leelanau County, Michigan, where Grand Traverse Band is. And you want to wonder what treaty rights meant between the time when they were negotiated and the time that Indian people started, like Billy Frank and Hank Adams, started exercising treaty rights. They were always there, and Indian people had always been negotiating those treaty rights. In the 1870s, or perhaps it was in the 1880s, in Bingham Township, Grand Traverse Band Indians went and tried to vote in a state election. And in 1850, Michigan had said, sure, we'll let Indians be citizens so long as they're civilized. And nobody really knew what that meant, so Indians went to the election, to the voting booths to find out. And what civilized meant was sign an affidavit saying you agree to abrogate your treaty rights, your individual treaty rights. Well, they wouldn't do it. So we move ahead many decades to the 1970s, and the fishing wars have already started in Washington State and have begun even a little bit in Michigan. And a Grand Traverse Band man who was a welder on the Mackinac Bridge named Arthur Duhamel was told by his father, whose name was Fish, that you need to go start fishing. It's time. And so he did. And he was arrested dozens and dozens of times. And his most famous quote that we didn't think of as famous until I decided that it was famous a few years ago, was something along the lines of, I respect the law, that's why I broke it. And it's a great way of articulating what he had done. And he'd been most notoriously been prosecuted in Leelanau County Circuit Court before a man named Judge Benedict. And this trial, one of the trials that he had, is notorious because the tribal leading, or actually the federal, they paid the money, leading expert witness, Helen Tanner, recounted the story years later at the University of Detroit Law School. And Judge Benedict, it was a Friday, Judge Benedict had a fishing trip scheduled, how ironic, the next day, and he was going to leave that night. And he intended to have the prosecution of Arthur Duhamel completed by the end of the day. They started at 8:30, and at 8:30, 12 hours later, they were still going strong, and they finally brought Helen Tanner up to talk about the treaty. And Judge Benedict asked the question, which is, I have a copy of the treaty, I can read it, and I can rule based on the treaty, and asked Ms. Professor Tanner, what do you have to say about the treaty? What else is there to say? And then he stopped and said, don't answer that question. And there was a long pause in the courtroom, and the prosecutor said, I would like to know what she has to say about the treaty. And he said, I don't want you to answer that question. And somebody in the back of the room, some Peshabi Town Indian, probably said also, we would also like to know what Ms. Tanner has to say about the treaty. And Judge Benedict supposedly said, anybody asks about the treaty again, you will be held in contempt of court and jailed. Ultimately, however, in United States versus Michigan, Professor Ms. Tanner was able to testify, and as I described, Article 13 still has viability in the modern era of Michigan Indian treaty rights. I guess the last thing I'm going to say before I conclude, because I'm taking one more minute, is that I find fascinating weird places where Indian treaty rights appear in pop culture, and I'll mention two of those. Have you guys ever heard of The Big Lebowski? Well, The Big Lebowski is based on an actual guy who was a production assistant or something for the Coen brothers. And in the movie, you may hear him talk about how he wrote the original Port Huron Statement, and he was one of the Seattle Seven prosecuted by the feds in 1970. Well, I think it was Martin Scorsese did a short documentary about that guy. His name is Jeff Dowd. And if you look into it, his prosecution was conducted actually by Judge Bolt of the famous Bolt decision. And the funny thing, perhaps, maybe not so funny, was that Jeff Dowd was absolutely convinced that Judge Bolt was completely senile in every way. It may be that he was just being mean because Bolt did put him in jail for 3 months anyway. The last one is in relation to Julia Sweeney, and she's one of my favorite actresses, and she was on Saturday Night Live for a while and then did a great stand-up or a monologue about her family called, I can't remember what it was called anymore, but everybody in her family for 1 year for some reason all had cancer. But it was really funny, trust me. And she recalled a moment when she was a child, and they lived in rural Oregon, and her father worked for the Department of Justice. He was an assistant United States attorney and a little bit of an alcoholic. And he woke her up one night because he was drinking, and it was dark, and she snuck up on him, and he was muttering to himself over and over again, "Those goddamn so-happies." And with that, I will conclude and thank you so much for having me here, and I hope to see you all at the book signing and later. And I actually, before I end, can we do one last thing? Can I do a selfie with you guys? I need to show this. I need my mom to be able to see that this thing that she made for me is going to be on TV.
Commodity cheese.
Let me go ahead.